Thank you everyone for joining our NT Ag webinar today. So today's webinar will be presented by Ian Biggs, who is our Senior Research Agronomist based in Katherine, and he's going to present an update on the CRCNA cropping project.
Thanks, Madison. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ian Biggs. I'm heading up the Diversification Agriculture team here based in Katherine. And as you can see on the title slide, there are a lot of people have put an effort into the data and this presentation from a lot of different organisations, not just DPIR. Agriculture in the NT has a long history. It's been ever since the Europeans started trying to build outposts in the on Melville Island and the Coburg Peninsula in 1824, when they started growing crops there to see what they could support those failed ventures, right through to the 1950s when Darwin was settled, and they started the first agricultural release of land in Palmerston, then trying to grow cotton, sugarcane on Cox Peninsula. The Chinese growers came over for gold and were very successful in growing lots of small crops and vegetable gardens, and they were actually very successful in their non-commercial way, but that only ceased when White Australia policy stopped them. And the Darwin Botanic Gardens were the first to really start doing sort of experimental new crops in the top end area, and all this happened in the late 1800s. And in this period also, there was some of the first shipments of cotton were actually exported to the UK, to the spinning mills in England. Then in the early 1900s, there was the first of experimental farms were set up around Batchelor, and we had peanut cropping developments in the Daly River and around Katherine. And again, these were all the plant species they were trying were successful, but the actual supply lines were too long. During World War II, army farms were set up along the Stuart Highway, all producing tons of fruit and vegetables for that local consumption use. And then post-World War II, we've had the NT government and NT administration setting up experimental farms in the NT. CSIRO were doing lots of work in Katherine and Douglas Daly, and they were starting to bring that systems-based approach and thought to the way that we look at minimum tillage and soil conservation. And we started to see some of these commercial developments starting with Territory Rice, Tipperary, Willaroo, where again they could grow the crop, but they either had weed issues contaminating their seed, and therefore the market they were trying to supply didn't work. The ADMA scheme is the Agriculture Development and Marketing Authority Act, which was around the Douglas Daly. And again, this was a cropping project, and while they had local markets, it was quite successful. The Peanut Company Australia grew a lot of peanuts around Kingaroy in the early 2000s, and again, they could grow the crop, but their supply lines back to market made the venture unviable. So in all these examples of almost 200 years of cropping in the NT, it's not that they can't grow the plants, it's just that they can't get the economics or the commercial realities to work. And so since World War II, there's just been millions of words and reports written about cropping and what the potential and what can be done, how to do it. Lots of surveys of soil and water analysis, and the political push to grow and develop the north. And as yet, as we can see, the north is still very linked to cattle grazing production, along with the major horticultural production. So none of that broadacre cropping has yet taken off. So when we look at the NT, it's about 1.4 million square kilometres, or about 7.5% of Australia. And just under half of that, 700,000 square kilometres, is in pastoral lease. 50% of that area is in natural conservation or Indigenous managed land. And there's only a small scattering of, just make out those small scatterings of colour which represent cropping and horticultural enterprises. So you can see it's a very small percentage of the land area that's devoted to intensive agriculture. When we look at the NT as a whole, we can see that most of the agricultural effort is all in the northern part of the NT. Those couple of areas down south of Tennant Creek and towards Alice Springs are where there are land on top of good aquifers, so they have access to water. When we look at the top of the NT, we find a very strong rainfall gradient as we go south from Darwin. And so we have this band around Katherine, which one receives some reasonable rainfall, but also overlies the Tyndall aquifer. So there's opportunity of getting groundwater, although access to that is highly contested. So most of our agricultural effort in the Northern Territory will be in this Katherine, Douglas Daly basin area. The areas south tend to, while they have good soils, they just don't have that water, and the climate is starting to get a bit hostile. So the issue with broadacre agriculture in the NT is really that it's regulated by the environment in the amount of rainfall and that you get, and the economics and supply lines to markets, as well as the input costs, which are all increased due to that isolation. There has been a lot of ad hoc economic studies in that 200 years of agricultural work in the NT, and we saw the need to get away from that and try and bring a systems approach to work. And this requires a framework or something to guide that development of agriculture, to try and de-risk the investments so that we can start seeing where those investments will work and understand the issues that are holding it back. Market drivers are always going to be an issue for the territory because of just the distance from market and the distance from some of those post-gate processing steps. Seen that of rangeland grazing will be a stepping stone to a more intensive agriculture. And that was always seen as you went from native grasslands to improved pasture, they might eventually move into broadacre cropping, and that has never quite been realised. But the actual diversification of the pastoral industry now, seeing the benefit of having some of those cropping byproducts, they're seeing the actual incentive and reason for going into that cropping and expanding that resource base on those pastoral leases. So that they're not only just looking for a cash crop from a commodity, but they're looking for the byproducts which can then feed into that cattle raising business. Rain-fed agriculture is always an opportunistic option, and this is the actual costs of getting in. You don't need bores, you don't need the infrastructure of reticulating the water, but it is more risky. So it's at all risk versus reward equation. So water is always the key. We can tend to grow most things in the territory. If you add water, you'll get growth. And the unique environment of the territory, that very definite wet, dry season driver, really sets up how you grow your crops. For long periods, it was seen that dry season was the optimum time to grow with irrigation water, but that access to irrigation water is the issue. So those water resources, either rain-fed, groundwater, river extraction, or surface storage, where they capture overland flow, are the four main sources. River extraction and surface storage are really limited. Surface storage is still being studied by the authorities who administer water extraction. So groundwater and rain-fed are the two sources of water that are really available. And groundwater is generally fully allocated, but perhaps underutilised. So rain-fed is the area that is the easy to access and potential for any agriculture going forward in the short term. And there's also a real need to link that's water source that you have to the soil that you have, such that if you are going to do any of those agriculture on the heavier soils, and during the wet season, you will not be able to get access to those soils, or they will be flooded. So that shortens or really fixes the cropping season that's available. And if you're going into rain-fed on soils which are lighter and clay and have that accessibility issues, then you need to have a soil that's deep enough and holds moisture to take you through from when the rain stops to when your crop is ready to grow. So all that access to soil and water are the main drivers that govern the crops that will be grown in the market system. And so that also sets up the quality of the product you're growing, and therefore that's where the market is a clear driver and governs that potential return to the grower. So the CRC funded potential for broadacre cropping in the NT project. It's a 2-year, 6-month project, commenced in January of this year and ending in June, 2.5 years' time. Total project value is just under 1.2 million, or 2.2 million, of which 665 is project funded and 1.3 comes from in kind. The project aims to try and collate a lot of that biophysical data which has been collected by previous research. It's collected by the Bureau, it's collected by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and bring that into a system which makes it available to users to access, and have that as a resource which can advise agricultural management and development. We'll try and use that to determine timing and length of potential cropping windows in various regions, which will be both driven by the soil type and the climate in those regions. And this will give us an idea of the impact of climate and those adapathic conditions on the yield and quality of it from the crops produced. Key science part of the project is using the simulation tools. And there are 3 collaborating groups who are into using AppSim and simulation tools to look at those cropping options at a paddock and hopefully scale that up to regional scale so we get an idea of that potential, cropping potential across the territory. To do that, we really need to make sure that those simulation programs are validated for the semi-arid tropical conditions. That has been done for some, but not for all. And that validation will require some crops which will be grown either on research farms or hopefully more likely on commercial farms. These commercial farm trials which are in this project will also be used as extension tools for educating NT farmers and interstate investors, both the issues around growing these selected targeted broadacre crops, especially as the high value crops that we're looking at are really high management and require specialist skills and experience to grow. The project aims to output communication extension plans and materials to support that development and help de-risk those future investments and inform growers and investors of potential. The natural resource database is, some of this is already available on the NT Maps site or the RMAP site, but we hope to refine that a little bit and make it more accessible. Cropping management scenarios, including cropping windows, will be developed, and that will be linked to this natural resource database. The AppSim, validated AppSim for semi-arid tropics will help being used across all semi-arid tropic regions. We'll see an increased capability amongst NT farmers as they learn these crops and understand the potential and for increasing the productivity of their farms. And there's the CropArm online tool, which is a website managed by the University of Southern Queensland, and that links a lot of this. That'll be a linking tool to pull together that natural resource database and the actual simulated crops, so that it becomes not a tool which you might look at once when you're doing some of your planning. So the project has a cast involved. So project collaborators, the research side is the Department of Prime Industries. University of Southern Queensland are doing some grains modelling and that AppSim, the CropArm side. CSIRO are looking at the cotton modelling side. Department of Environment and Natural Resources are helping us with that biophysical data in the soil, and also they're supplying their rig for doing soil testing, sampling. DAF Queensland are doing modelling and simulation around the pulses and the peanuts. NT Farmers Association have a strong part of this project in working with those farms on getting those crops growing on farm. Cottonseed distributors are helping with the supply of cottonseed to our participating growers. We have 7 farms there who are actually signed on to the project. Tipperary, Ruby Downs, Bindaroo, Edith Farms Station, Edith Springs Station that should be, Minaroo Station, Neutral Junction and Ulu Farms down in southern NT. But we also have other farms. So we're looking at trying to get 7 farms growing cotton to twice a year, and we're looking at getting at least 3 farms growing peanuts, and we hope to get other farms growing other grain crops. The funding agencies are the CRC for Developing Northern Australia, GRDC, or the Grains Research Development Corporation, and the Cotton Research Development Corporation. So the DPI has been looking at cotton since we started looking at Flying Fox Station and revisiting the options of cotton in the NT, and then we find that the Ord Valley and in North Queensland cotton has been grown, and so the actual farmers in the territory were looking east and west and seeing this and thinking that would also grow on their properties. So in 2019 or 2018, this industry or bottom-led push made it beholden on the department to try and grow a trial crop of cotton again at Katherine Research Station. This had been done in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so in 2019, we planted a trial with the 4 Bollgard varieties. We had 3 planting times and 3 reps of each of those 4 varieties. We also had a dryland trial where we looked at that full plant, 1 metre row spacing, then a single skip and double skip treatments. The irrigated trial, we didn't apply our irrigation water strategically. We simply applied whenever the crop looked stressed or when the moisture probes told us the crop was getting stressed, really to make sure we had a good crop. So we were applying somewhere between 7 to 8 megalitres per hectare of water on top of the rainfall, which was low in that year anyway. And that yielded crops around that 10 bales per hectare, as you can see to the right-hand photo. The dryland crop, which only got that 500 mils of in-crop rain and nothing after April, it only went about 1.6 bales per hectare. So again, this crop on site was incredibly interesting. We had 700 odd visitors coming to KRS that year looking at the crop. So there was still a lot of interest in that, in the cotton industry and the potential. So come the 2020 wet season, there were 3 growers in 2019, and now in 2020 we have 6 commercial farms growing cotton, and we've started our project. The on-farm trials are being run at Tipperary, the Douglas Daly region and Katherine region, so there's 822 hectares planted this year, 616 dry land and 206 irrigated. The last of that was harvested on last Sunday. We did try doing another dryland planting here at KRS, but due to the poor wet season that failed, and one farmer did not plant due to the poor season start. So the trial work commenced for us to gather the data to aid CSIRO to use to tweak the APSIM Auscot model, to validate that against other crops and to see if that can work in the semi-arid tropics. So the Auscot model was developed in Narrabri in New South Wales and works down there, but once we come up to the territory, we just find that the speed the plant grows, the leaf area, the leaf to fruit ratio, just doesn't cope with that very well. So it needs to be tweaked and validated. And that requires intensive crop and soil monitoring. So the rest of this talk will be much more about photos. We're just pulling our data together at the moment and collating that. Then we'll start analysing, and then CSIRO will then look to start simulating and modelling that data. So 2 of the key aspects of the work are soil sampling. So the series across the top. At the start, we were using hand augers to get down to 1.5 metres. Then in crop, we had a host hole driver tool which drove our tubes down to 2.1 metres. And finally, after harvest, we had the DENR crew come with their hydraulic device, and that was getting us down to 3.5 metres. So we're capturing that full. The model simulates water movement in the soil as well as nitrogen movement. And by doing this deep coring, we're also getting a little bit of an indication of where the rate of root growth under the plant as well. And so we were finding roots down to about 2.5 metres under these crops, under irrigated and dryland crops. The plant biomass analysis involves plant populations. We've tagged very young plants and we track those plants through their life, measuring heights and node numbers. Then during the crop, there are biomass samples taken. which are then analysed for leaf area, separated into leaves and stems and fruiting parts. And at the end of the season, we're doing in-crop hand sampling of selected areas. So the only data I have is actually some of our hand sampled yield data. This is one of the irrigated sites. It was planted in late January, so it's merged with dicots in early February. Yeah, planted early February, so a couple of days, a week later, you can see the seedlings are emerged and starting to establish. And then every month we see that crop grow till it was harvested. This crop was harvested last Sunday. So this crop grew very quickly for those first 4 months, and then we started getting a bit of cold weather and everything slowed down. So some of series of photos here show that when we're doing our hand picks and final yields on these crops. So the top left was a dryland crop near Catherine, which only received something like 400 mils of rain at the start of the season and then nothing for the last few months. That hand yield indicated around 2.1 bales per hectare, and I think their commercial yield was something fairly similar. It just shows the resilience of that. These are all the same variety of cotton grown in different areas. The second photo in the middle and the top is a dryland crop in the Douglas Daly area. It was grown on, into a zero mulch. It was into a plain, worked up ex-mahogany plantation. And that went about 3.8 bales per hectare, and I think the commercial yield was something fairly similar. Two other dryland crops in the Douglas Daly went similar hand yields and similar sort of commercial yields as well. Dryland crop at Tipperary had a very two parts. There's 200 hectares of dryland cotton here. The top part where we had our samples was a much deeper, redder soil. Down the bottom was a much a more alluvial white soil, and so that also went around the 3.5 bales per hectare. The irrigated sites, we can see the growers are all a little bit disappointed in that, and I think, but the issues here are really around the regulation of their water. The site which has Millie standing on the bottom left-hand side, there was a shallow soil with a rock ledge underneath, and so getting the right irrigation was very difficult at that site. The two Douglas Daly sites in the middle bottom and the bottom right were both the growers really learning what they were doing, but they were hoping to get 10 bales per hectare out of that, and they've gone a little bit short. But their learnings from that will clearly indicate where they can go learn for next year. The grains part of its component will be, this project will also be a very key. We've chosen peanuts as one of our key crops, and this is because the territory, to get the return when you're doing irrigation, we need a high value crop, and confectionery peanuts offer that offer the potential that high return. Other crops don't quite offer the same gross margin value peanuts do, but they will all be studied. Some preliminary APSIM modelling for Ali Krung, which is south of Tennant Creek, that central NT area, showed 2 parts of the year. So planting in that February-March period, in the hot period, and growing the crop into the colder months, gave much better simulated yields than growing the crop in the colder period and growing into the heat. So the project intends to try and plant peanuts in the August-September period to test that lower yield time of the year, and then plant more trials early next year, so we start testing that second part of the period when we're planting in the heat and growing into the cool, and to really test, see how the model is working at that site. Other grain crops will be certainly dealt with through extensive modelling of the grain options. These are really looking for rotation options to support the cotton peanut cropping cycle. Because it's likely that the cotton and peanuts will really be the key crop, and the other crops will support. It's a matter of getting those rotations so that they don't lose money, but also don't hinder the key crop that's in the cycle. And this will really help develop that farming system approach to maximise that whole of farm return, including the additional benefit to the pastoral operations when we start increasing cropping regions. We think we'll try and get some planting of pulses on research farms, but that'll really come down to resources available. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. That was absolutely wonderful.